Why did the colonel's laugh feel heavier than shrapnel? Maya Rodriguez stood in that small, cold office as though the walls themselves were judging her. His voice had cut through the air like a verdict, echoing across medals, framed photographs, and the flag standing proudly in the corner. A laugh, sharp, dismissive, cruel. Not the kind of sound you expect from a commander who had sworn to understand his soldiers. Not the kind of sound you forget. She stood at attention, every line of her uniform pressed to perfection. She had fought too long, carried too much to show weakness now, but the colonel's words gnawed at her composure. Health issues, at 26, you stand straight, you look fine. What could possibly be wrong with you? His questions weren't questions at all. They were accusations, assumptions wrapped in authority. He thought she was faking, bending the rules, trying to escape duty. He didn't know. He couldn't know, not yet. Her jaw tightened. She kept her eyes locked ahead, but inside, a storm churned. The same storm that had followed her since that convoy in Helmand Province. The same storm that sometimes woke her in the dead of night, heart pounding, chest burning, fragments shifting beneath her skin. She could have told him then. She could have unbuttoned her uniform, shown him what she carried carved into her flesh. But instead, she said nothing. Silence was safer. Dignity was quieter. The colonel leaned closer, eyes like sharpened steel. Invisible injuries, Sergeant. Do you expect me to believe in something I can't see? Soldiers bleed. Soldiers lose limbs. Soldiers die. What excuse do you bring me? Excuse. That word pierced deeper than any fragment of metal. She had never allowed herself to believe survival was an excuse. She remembered the blast, the fire, the scream of tearing steel. She remembered 3 names carved in stone who had never come back. And now a man who had never been there laughed at her for asking to breathe, to be checked, to be monitored. Her throat tightened. She thought of the others. The ones who never said a word about their headaches, their panic, their nightmares. The ones who went on pretending until silence crushed them. How many of them had been dismissed with the same laugh? How many had folded under the weight of being doubted? "Sir," she said carefully, her voice steady though her palms trembled behind her back, "appearances can be deceiving." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a long moment the colonel said nothing. His smug smile remained, but behind his eyes a flicker of irritation burned. He leaned back, lacing his fingers across his chest, as though daring her to continue. She didn't, not yet. She wasn't ready to tear open that silence. Not here, not in this office where pride and scars collided. But something had shifted inside her, something heavy, unmovable. She couldn't keep hiding forever. And that was the moment, though neither of them knew it, when everything began to change. Later that night, Maya lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling. The barracks were quiet, save for the occasional cough or restless turn of another soldier. She held her breath, waiting for the familiar burn, the dull throb in her chest that came whenever the fragments reminded her they were still inside. Sometimes she could almost feel them move, tiny shards of metal pressing against muscle, scraping nerves, reminding her of that day. 52. That was the number they had counted. Some removed, some left behind. A few so dangerously close to her heart and lungs that surgeons at Walter Reed had told her extraction was suicide. "You'll live with them," one doctor had said flatly, as though it was an inconvenience, not a lifelong sentence. She had nodded then. Soldiers nodded. Soldiers accepted. But no one had told her about the dizziness, the pounding headaches, the sudden blur of vision when a fragment shifted. No one had explained how silence at a briefing could feel heavier than the blast itself. She pressed her hand to her sternum, feeling the uneven ridges beneath her skin. She had memorized them. Each scar a map of survival. Each mark a reminder of what she had carried out of that desert. But she couldn't tell them. Not yet. Not the colonel, not her peers, not even the soldiers who looked up to her for strength. Strength, that word had been drilled into her since basic. Don't show weakness. Don't complain. Don't falter. She had repeated it like scripture. But sometimes in the stillness of the night she wondered, Was silence strength or was it surrender? Her mind drifted back to the convoy. The desert sun, the grinding wheels, the split-second glare before fire consumed the world. She remembered the way sound vanished, replaced by a ringing so sharp she thought it would slice her brain in half. She remembered hands pulling her from the wreckage, her own blood pooling around twisted fragments of armor and flesh. And she remembered the look in her commander's eyes as they zipped 3 of her brothers into black bags. She had lived. They hadn't. That truth alone carried more weight than her body sometimes could bear. The laugh echoed again in her head, cruel, dismissing. The colonel hadn't just doubted her. He had doubted all of them, everyone who carried wounds that didn't scream for attention, everyone who looked fine on the outside but was torn apart inside. Her fists clenched against the mattress. She wanted to sleep. She wanted to forget. But sleep rarely came easily. When it did, it was laced with fire, with voices she could never answer, with silence louder than explosions. And yet, in those restless hours, a thought grew stronger. She couldn't let it end here. She couldn't let his laugh be the last word. 2 days later, she stood again outside the colonel's office. The hallway buzzed with the footsteps of soldiers moving briskly to morning assignments. The scent of coffee drifted faintly from the staff room. She adjusted her cap, straightened her uniform, and knocked. "Enter." He was there behind the desk, silver hair catching the morning light. His gaze lifted slowly, eyes cool, detached. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched long, like a battlefield pause before the first shot. She stepped forward, saluted, and stood tall. The weight inside her pressed harder, urging her to speak, to explain, to defend. But she held it in, controlled, steady. The colonel gestured to a chair. "Sit, Sergeant." She obeyed, though it felt unnatural to lower herself under that watchful gaze. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," he said, voice even but not soft. "You told me appearances can be deceiving. That was an interesting choice of words. Care to elaborate?" Her pulse quickened. She had expected more dismissal, more doubt, but something in his tone suggested curiosity. Still skeptical, still cold, but different. She took a breath. "Sir, some wounds don't show. Some battles follow us home. That doesn't make them less real." His brow furrowed. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Are you telling me you're unfit for duty?" "No, sir." Her answer came sharp, almost too quick. "I've carried out every mission assigned to me. I've completed every task despite the challenges. I don't seek excuses, I seek understanding." The colonel studied her. His eyes narrowed as if trying to pierce through layers she had spent years building. "Understanding is earned, Sergeant. Trust is earned. And from where I sit, your story is incomplete." Her breath caught. Incomplete. That word stung because it was true. She had never told the full story, not to anyone outside the medics. Classified reports buried the details. Silence had become her shield. But shields grow heavy, and hers was beginning to crack. She didn't answer, not yet. That night she sat alone in the mess hall long after the others had gone. The chairs were stacked, the lights dimmed, but she stayed, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. Her reflection stared back from the darkened window, strong posture, tired eyes. She thought of her mother's voice back home, soft and worried. "Mija, why don't you just come back? Haven't you given enough?" She had given, but was it enough? Could it ever be enough? Her thoughts returned to the colonel, to his doubt, his laugh, his challenge. She wanted to hate him, but somewhere deep inside, she wondered, had he simply never seen? Had no one ever shown him what invisible wounds looked like, felt like? Maybe that was why she was still here, not just to serve, not just to survive, but to show. The decision took root quietly, almost without her noticing. A seed planted in the cracks of her silence. She would show him, not with words, not with excuses, but with the truth carved into her skin. And when she did, nothing would be the same again. What did silence sound like when it shattered pride? The colonel's voice droned on. a sermon about duty and discipline, words she had heard 100 times before. But Maya wasn't listening anymore. She stood rigid, her pulse hammering against her ribs, her decision forming in the quiet corners of her mind. She had tried silence, tried professionalism, tried to protect her story, to protect herself. But the weight of his laughter, the dismissal in his eyes, it left her with no choice. If he demanded proof, he would have it. Her fingers moved slowly to her collar, one button, then another. Each click of fabric parting felt louder than the colonel's words. At first he didn't notice. His lecture about excuses rolled forward heavy, certain. But then his eyes narrowed, his voice faltered. "Sergeant, what do you think you're doing?" She kept her movements deliberate, calm, controlled. Her hands did not tremble. When her shirt loosened enough, she pulled the fabric back. The colonel's expression froze. Across her chest and shoulder, scars twisted like rivers of violence. Raised ridges, pale lines, deep marks carved into muscle and skin. Some looked like craters where metal had once burrowed deep. Others ran jagged, as though a blade of fire had slashed through her flesh. 52 pieces of shrapnel, each one had left its mark. For the first time since she'd entered that office, the colonel said nothing. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His posture sagged. The arrogance drained from his face. "These," Maya said quietly, her voice steady as stone, "are from an IED explosion in Helmand Province 4 years ago. Our convoy was attacked while delivering communication equipment to a remote outpost. 3 soldiers died. 52 fragments of steel tore into me. Some were removed, some weren't. The ones that remained shift sometimes. They press against nerves, against organs. They cause the headaches, the dizziness, the hearing loss. That's why I request medical appointments, sir. Not because I'm lazy, not because I'm weak, but because survival has consequences." She turned slightly, showing the scars running along her ribs and back. Each one glistened faintly under the office light. Each one a story he had never asked to hear. The colonel stared, silent, pale. His hands trembled against the desk. The man who had laughed minutes ago now looked smaller, like someone suddenly exposed to a truth too heavy to dismiss. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Sergeant, I had no idea." "No, sir," she replied, buttoning her shirt with deliberate calm. "You didn't, because I don't talk about it, because I don't use it as an excuse, because I chose to keep serving even with this." Her words cut through the silence sharper than any reprimand. The colonel looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor, then the window. His silver hair caught the light, but the sharp authority in his posture had vanished. He stood there, back rigid, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally, his voice carrying something unfamiliar, uncertainty. "Because it's mine," she answered. "Because my medical information is private. Because I believed my record, my commitment, and my actions were enough to prove my worth. I didn't think I should have to reveal my scars to be taken seriously." The colonel swallowed hard, his throat tightening against words he wasn't used to saying. "I owe you an apology, Sergeant." Maya held her silence. She didn't nod, didn't thank him, didn't soften the blow. Some truths were not meant to be cushioned. He sank into his chair, eyes distant. For the first time, Maya saw something in him she hadn't expected: shame. The next morning, the base whispered. Rumors moved faster than the wind. No one knew the details, but they knew something had shifted. Soldiers spoke quietly about the colonel's sudden visit to the medical facility, about the long meeting he held with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the chief medical officer, about the way he asked questions instead of giving orders. Maya tried to ignore it. She carried on with her duties, logging communications, maintaining systems, training younger specialists. But everywhere she went, eyes lingered on her just a little longer, not with suspicion, not with dismissal, but with curiosity. It unsettled her. She had never wanted to be the center of attention. She had never wanted her scars to become a symbol. Yet something inside her whispered, Maybe this is bigger than you. Weeks later, Maya found herself standing in front of a classroom full of officers and senior NCOs. Her uniform felt heavier than usual, though it carried no extra weight. Her palms were damp, but her eyes remained fixed forward. "Good morning," she began, her voice stronger than she expected. "My name is Sergeant Maya Rodriguez. I've been asked to speak today about invisible wounds." The room was silent. Dozens of faces stared back, some skeptical, some curious, some already softened by a hint of regret. She took a breath. 4 years ago, an IED tore through my convoy. 52 fragments of shrapnel entered my body. Surgeons removed most of them, but some remain. They move. They cause pain. They remind me every day of what service costs. A pause. She let the silence breathe. But this isn't just about me. This is about every soldier who carries something you can't see. Chronic pain, traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, nightmares, panic, guilt, fear. We walk among you looking fine, looking strong, but carrying battles that didn't end when deployment did. And too often when we ask for help, we're met with doubt, with laughter, with dismissal. Her voice trembled for a moment, but she steadied it. "I was lucky. I survived. I came back. But others are crushed not by what happened overseas, but by what happens here, when silence feels safer than speaking, when laughter feels louder than their pain." The room remained quiet, but this time it was not the silence of dismissal, it was the silence of listening. When the session ended, one by one, officers approached her. Some shook her hand. Some apologized. Some confessed their own struggles, stories they had never spoken aloud. Major Torres, eyes wet with tears, admitted she had given one of her soldiers a hard time for requesting medical appointments. Captain Garcia admitted he had hidden his own hearing loss for years. Her scars had done what her silence never could. They had opened a door. That night, alone again in her bunk, Maya stared at the ceiling. She felt different, not lighter, not free, but useful. Her scars had always been reminders of what she had lost, but now, maybe, they were also proof of what could change. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the familiar ridges. They would always be there. The fragments would always move. The pain would never fully leave. But maybe that was the point. Because sometimes the scars spoke louder than silence. The colonel, meanwhile, was changing too. Soldiers noticed him at the medical facility more often, listening instead of commanding. He attended every training session Maya spoke at, his notebook filled with scribbled observations. His once harsh gaze softened when he passed injured soldiers in the hall. For the first time, Maya began to wonder, maybe even the hardest men can change. Maybe even laughter can turn into listening. And maybe, just maybe, her silence had finally found its voice. How much weight can one soldier's story carry? At first, Maya thought the answer was simple: none. Her scars were hers alone. Her pain, her silence, her survival, private burdens not meant for others to see. But as weeks passed, the ripples spread wider than she had ever imagined. It began small. A lieutenant who stopped her in the corridor to thank her for speaking. A medic who told her 3 soldiers had finally shown up for appointments they'd been avoiding. A private who whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "I didn't think I was allowed to feel like this." Every word, every confession, every moment of eye contact chipped away at the wall she had built around herself. The wall of silence. The wall that had once kept her safe, but now felt like a prison. Still, she doubted. Doubt never left completely. At night, when the barracks dimmed and voices faded, she lay awake, staring at scars illuminated by the thin sliver of moonlight. Were they really helping anyone? Or was she just reopening wounds, her own and others, in the name of something that might fade like a rumor? But the change was undeniable. Even the colonel seemed different. Maya saw him standing in the medical facility one morning talking with Dr. Martinez. His stance wasn't rigid. His hands weren't folded behind his back in that commanding posture. He leaned forward slightly, listening listening in a way that seemed foreign to him, his notebook filled with questions, diagrams, acronyms. When Maya walked past, he caught her eye. For once, he didn't look through her. He looked at her and nodded. It was the smallest gesture, but it said everything. The first time Maya stood before enlisted soldiers, not officers, she nearly froze. The room was packed with privates and corporals, their faces younger, their expressions less guarded. Some leaned back with arms crossed, skepticism written across their posture. Others leaned forward, eager but anxious, as though waiting for permission to exhale. Maya cleared her throat. The microphone buzzed faintly in her hand. "I want to tell you about silence," she began. The words seemed to settle over them. 4 years ago, I survived something that should have killed me. I carry pieces of it inside me every day. They shift. They hurt. But none of that is worse than the silence. The silence I kept because I thought no one would believe me. The silence that felt heavier than the scars. A murmur rippled through the room. Soldiers glanced at each other, then back at her. "I'm not here to tell you to be strong," she continued, her voice steady, deliberate. "I'm here to tell you that strength isn't silence. Strength is speaking when your body or your mind needs help. Strength is admitting the wounds you carry, even if no one can see them." She paused, scanning the crowd. Dozens of faces, eyes fixed on her now. "Don't let silence bury you. Don't let fear of judgment stop you. Because one day you'll find yourself standing where I stood, and the cost of staying quiet will be more than you can bear." When she finished, the room was quiet. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another. Then the sound built, rolling forward until the entire room erupted in applause. Maya didn't smile. She didn't bow. She just nodded once and stepped away from the microphone, her heart pounding. Outside the classroom, a young soldier lingered, barely 19. His uniform hung loose on his frame, his expression heavy. "Sergeant," he whispered, I think I need help." Maya didn't ask for details. She didn't pry. She simply walked with him to the medical wing. Sometimes strength wasn't found in speeches. Sometimes it was in quiet footsteps beside someone too afraid to walk alone. The colonel called her back to his office weeks later. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Gone was the sharp edge in his voice, the skepticism in his gaze. The desk that once served as a barrier now looked like a shared table. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he began, softer than before, "your story has started something I never expected. Soldiers are coming forward. Officers are listening. Commanders are changing the way they think. And it's because you spoke." Maya shook her head slightly. "It's not me, sir. It's the truth. They just needed permission to hear it." He leaned back, exhaling. "Maybe. But it was your courage that forced me to see what I'd been blind to. And I'll tell you this, I was wrong, dead wrong, about you, about all of it." The words sounded heavy in his mouth, as though they weren't used to being spoken. But they were honest. "I owe you more than an apology," he continued. "I owe you change, real change." And change came. Mandatory training sessions, open-door policies, a culture that no longer punished appointments as weakness but recognized them as survival. Slowly, painfully, the tone of the base shifted. Soldiers who once whispered about their struggles began to speak louder. Leaders who once scoffed at complaints began to ask questions instead of dismissals. And Maya, who once thought her scars were hers alone, became the face of something she never intended, an advocate for invisible wounds. But advocacy came at a price. Every time she stood in front of a crowd, she relived the blast. Every time she told her story, she heard the laughter again, the silence again, the three names again. Every scar tugged at her memory like a string tied to a battlefield that would never let go. At night the dreams grew sharper. Flames, screams, metal tearing, the guilt of survival pressing heavier against her ribs than the shrapnel itself. Some mornings she woke drenched in sweat, clutching her chest, unsure if the fragments had shifted or if it was just the memories cutting into her again. And still she spoke, because each time someone stayed behind, someone whispered, "Me too." The colonel's transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. One afternoon, Maya caught sight of him walking through the medical wing, not inspecting, not commanding, just walking. He stopped at a soldier's bed, a young corporal with a bandaged arm. The colonel sat down, leaned in, listened. It was such a simple act, but Maya saw the difference. The same man who once mocked invisible wounds now sat with visible patience, with visible care. Later that day, Dr. Martinez pulled Maya aside. "Do you realize what you've done? He asks more questions than some of my medical staff. He writes notes. He checks research. I've never seen a commander so determined to learn." Maya shook her head. "It wasn't me, it was the scars." "No," Dr. Martinez corrected gently. "It was you choosing to show them." The base shifted slowly, but it shifted. Soldiers walked into medical without fear of retaliation. Officers began to address invisible wounds in briefings. Conversations that once felt forbidden began to echo across the mess hall and training fields. But Maya still carried doubt. She wondered if it would last, if the change was only temporary, if her scars would fade from memory the moment she left Fort Campbell. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the training grounds, she sat on a bench watching the sky turn from orange to purple. A private sat down beside her, the same 19-year-old she had once walked to the medical wing. "Sergeant," he said, his voice steadier now, "I've been going to counseling. I didn't think it would help, but it does. I can sleep now. I can breathe." Maya turned to look at him. His eyes no longer carried the same weight they once had. There was light there. He hesitated, then added, "Thank you for not letting me stay silent." She said nothing, just nodded. Sometimes words weren't needed. As the last rays of sun slipped beneath the horizon, Maya pressed her hand to her chest again. The scars tugged. The fragments ached. But for the first time, the pain didn't feel like punishment. It felt like purpose. And yet one question lingered, one that echoed in the quiet moments. How long could one soldier carry not just her own wounds, but the weight of everyone else? The answer would come, but not yet. Why did the idea of becoming an officer feel heavier than 52 scars? The colonel's voice had been calm that day, almost warm. He had handed her a folded piece of paper, official, stamped with authority. "Your application for officer candidate school has been approved," he said. "Congratulations, Sergeant, you've earned it." Maya stared at the paper, the words swimming in front of her. OCS, a path to the commission, leadership, responsibility beyond her rank. She should have felt proud, she should have felt ready, but all she felt was weight. Was this really who she was meant to be? An officer, standing in front of soldiers, carrying not just her scars but their expectations. She folded the paper carefully, slipping it into her pocket. "Thank you, sir," she managed. Her voice didn't betray the storm inside. The colonel leaned back in his chair. "Don't thank me. You earned this. Everything you've done, the way you've changed this base, it's leadership. And leadership belongs at the officer level." But was it leadership, or was it survival masquerading as strength? That night Maya walked the base alone. The lights along the perimeter fence flickered against the darkness. Soldiers passed her in small groups, laughing, talking, their boots echoing across the pavement. She envied them. Not their youth, not their freedom, but their ability to live in the moment without ghosts clinging to every step. Her hand brushed her chest unconsciously. The scars throbbed faintly, as though reminding her they were still there, still shaping everything. Was she ready to step into a role where her scars weren't just hers, but a symbol? The thought unsettled her. The next week, she stood once again before a group of soldiers. This time, the audience was larger, enlisted, officers, even medical staff gathered together. The colonel himself sat in the front row, his notebook resting on his lap. Maya began slowly. You've heard my story, you've seen the scars, but today I want to ask a question. What happens when the scars define you? The room stirred, heads tilted, soldiers shifted in their seats. She continued, her voice steady but low. For months now I've spoken about invisible wounds. I've listened to your stories, your struggles, your pain, and every time I've wondered, am I still Maya or am I just the woman with scars? Do you see me or do you only see them? The silence in the room grew heavy. Because here's the truth, she said. Being defined by scars is another kind of wound, one that doesn't bleed but one that can suffocate. We are more than what has hurt us. We are more than what we survived. She let the words hang, her chest rising and falling with the effort. I share my story not because I want to be remembered for it, but because I want to live beyond it. I want all of us to. When she finished, there was no applause, not immediately, just silence, deep, thoughtful silence. Then, slowly, the sound built. But this time the applause wasn't for the scars, it was for the truth. Afterward, the colonel approached her. His voice was quiet, almost careful. You're right, scars don't define you, but they do remind us. They remind us of the cost, and sometimes soldiers need reminding. Maya looked at him, searching his eyes. But what if reminding them keeps me trapped? For once, the colonel had no answer. Weeks blurred into months. Training sessions grew into full programs. The initiative spread beyond Fort Campbell. Commanders from other bases called, requesting copies of materials, asking Maya to share her story remotely. The whispers reached higher commands. General Hayes arrived, her presence a storm of authority wrapped in calm composure. Maya stood in the briefing room, nerves tight as steel, while the general listened to presentations about the initiative. When it ended, Hayes turned to the colonel. I've been hearing remarkable things. This program has potential beyond this base. It could be army-wide. The colonel didn't hesitate. The credit belongs to Sergeant Rodriguez. Maya stiffened. With respect, ma'am, this wasn't me. It was every soldier who trusted me with their story. I just happened to be the first one who spoke aloud. The general studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Sometimes the first one is the hardest. Don't forget that. But with recognition came fear. Late at night, lying in her bunk, Maya's chest burned with a question she couldn't silence. If she became an officer, if she left this base, would the progress crumble without her? Would soldiers slip back into silence? The weight pressed on her until her chest felt like it might cave. She dreamed of the blast again. Not just the fire, not just the screaming, but the silence afterward, the silence louder than any explosion. She woke gasping, clutching her sternum. Sweat soaked her sheets. For a moment she thought the fragments had shifted again, but it was only the past alive inside her, clawing at her ribs. She sat on the edge of her bunk until dawn, her hands shaking, her eyes fixed on the horizon as it shifted from black to gray to gold. And still, when the morning bell rang, she stood, uniform pressed, posture perfect, face calm. Because silence was a battle too. The colonel saw it. One evening he called her to his office again. The light outside his window was fading, the sky painted orange. He didn't sit behind the desk this time. He stood by the window, hands clasped, gaze distant. You look tired, Sergeant, he said. I'm fine, sir. You're not, he replied quietly. You carry too much, I can see it. Maya shifted uncomfortably. With respect, sir, I've carried worse. That's the problem, he said, turning to face her. You think you can carry everything, but leadership isn't about carrying alone. It's about teaching others to carry with you. She didn't respond. His words cut too close to the truth she didn't want to admit. Finally, he added, officer training isn't about putting you on a pedestal. It's about giving you tools. Tools to make this movement bigger than one person, bigger than one set of scars. Maya looked at him, the weight of his words pressing harder than his laugh ever had. For the first time, she realized something. Maybe leadership wasn't about leaving her scars behind. Maybe it was about teaching others not to be crushed by theirs. The day her orders came, she packed her duffel in silence. Soldiers she had mentored stopped by to shake her hand to thank her. Some hugged her awkwardly, unsure if it was appropriate but too grateful to hold back. Private Kim, the 19-year-old who had once whispered his fears, stood at the doorway. "Sergeant, I don't know what to say. You saved me." Maya shook her head. "No, you saved yourself. You chose to speak. Never forget that." His eyes glistened. "But I wouldn't have if you hadn't gone first." Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something more, something profound. But sometimes silence was more honest than words. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded. When she left Fort Campbell, the base felt different. Not perfect, not healed, but changed. The whispers of doubt were softer, the voices of honesty louder. And though she carried her scars with her, she left behind something greater, a seed that would grow without her. As the bus pulled away, Maya pressed her forehead to the window. Her chest ached with the familiar throb of shrapnel shifting. But for once, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like reminder. Reminder that her journey wasn't ending. It was only beginning. But still the question haunted her, pressing louder than ever. Could she become more than her scars, without losing what they had taught her? The answer waited at officer school, at the Pentagon, in rooms she had never imagined standing in. But for now she sat quietly, the hum of the engine beneath her, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. Her scars burned faintly under her uniform, not a wound, not a weakness. A compass. Why did officer school feel like starting over, like all her scars meant nothing here? The bus ride had been long, the silence broken only by the drone of the engine and the quiet breathing of strangers. But the moment Maya stepped onto the grounds of Officer Candidate School, she felt it, the shift. Soldiers moved with sharp precision, voices clipped, orders barked. No one here cared who she had been at Fort Campbell. No one here knew her story. And for a moment, Maya was grateful. No whispers about scars, no sideways glances at the medical wing, no expectations. Just another candidate in pressed uniform, standing at attention in a sea of equals. But equality came with a price. She was back at the beginning, stripped of reputation, measured only by what she would prove here. The instructors wasted no time. Drills, marches, endless tests of endurance. The heat pressed against her body like a furnace, sweat stinging her eyes, lungs burning. She welcomed it. Physical pain was easier, predictable, manageable. Every push-up, every mile run was something she could fight with muscle and grit. It was the invisible weight that scared her more, the migraines that flared without warning, the sudden dizziness when a fragment shifted, the fear that one mistake would expose what she carried. She pushed through, teeth clenched, never faltering where eyes could see. But at night in the dorms, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady breaths of the others, feeling the restless shards inside her chest, wondering if silence would betray her again. The first test came sooner than expected. It was during a field exercise, a navigation course across rough terrain. Candidates were split into teams, each tasked with locating checkpoints under a blazing sun. The air shimmered with heat. Dust clung to every breath. Maya led her small group, compass in hand, eyes fixed on the map. She had done this before in deserts far harsher, under threats far greater. But as they trudged through a dry ravine, a sharp spike of pain ripped across her chest. She stumbled, vision blurring. "Rodriguez, you good?" one of her teammates asked, his tone half concern, half suspicion. She forced a nod, steadying herself against a rock. "Fine, keep moving." But inside, panic swirled. The fragments had shifted again. She could feel them pressing against nerves, sending fire down her side. She clenched her jaw, willed her body to keep moving. Failure wasn't an option. Weakness wasn't an option. Hours later, they reached the final checkpoint. Her uniform was soaked through, her hands trembling, but she hadn't faltered again. No one spoke of the stumble. No one asked questions. That night, as she sat on her bunk, she whispered to herself, "Appearances can be deceiving." And for once, the words weren't a defense. They were a shield. Days bled into weeks. The pressure mounted. Academic exams, leadership evaluations, field maneuvers. Maya performed well, not perfect, but steady. Instructors noted her composure, her calm under pressure, her ability to lead without raising her voice. But whispers began to spread, not about scars, not about weakness, about something else. "She's too calm," one candidate muttered after an exercise, "like she's hiding something." "She doesn't break," another said. "Nobody that composed." The irony cut deep. At Fort Campbell, silence had been mistaken for weakness. Here it was mistaken for invincibility. Both were wrong, both missed the truth. She wasn't invincible. She wasn't unbreakable. She was just unwilling to let them see the cracks. The breaking point came during a leadership evaluation. Each candidate was assigned a scenario: lead a squad across hostile terrain, make tactical decisions under simulated fire. Maya's turn came under a gray sky, rain spitting down, mud slick beneath their boots. Her squad looked at her expectantly. She gave clear orders, steady, precise. They moved, covered ground, took positions. Then, halfway through the exercise, a simulated explosion rang out, blanks and smoke, harmless but designed to rattle. Maya froze. For a split second, the rain disappeared. The mud disappeared. She was back in Helmand. Fire tearing the air apart, screams, the ringing silence that followed, the weight of bodies beside her. Her chest tightened, her vision tunneled. "Rodriguez," one of her squad members shouted, snapping her back. She blinked, forced herself to breathe. The rain returned, the mud, the exercise. She barked an order, too sharp, too rushed, and the squad moved again. They finished the scenario. Technically, it was a success, but Maya knew. She had frozen just for a second, but long enough. The instructor's eyes lingered on her afterward, not critical but searching. She avoided his gaze. That night she sat on her bunk, head in her hands. The fragments inside her felt heavier than ever. Not just the metal, the memories, the silence. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "I'm not just the scars. I'm not just the scars." But the words felt hollow. The colonel called one evening. She hadn't expected it. Candidates rarely received personal calls. His voice carried through the static of the line, low, steady. "How's it going?" he asked. Maya hesitated. She wanted to say fine, wanted to say strong, but the truth slipped out. "Harder than I thought." There was a pause, then, "Good. If it were easy, it wouldn't matter." She almost laughed. "That's not exactly comforting, sir." "No," he admitted. "But it's true. Listen, Rodriguez, leadership isn't about never freezing. It's about moving after you do. Don't forget that." She sat in silence, the phone pressed to her ear, her chest tight. Finally, she whispered, "Do you really think I can do this?" The colonel's reply came without hesitation. "I don't just think it. I know it, because you already have. At Campbell, with me. With every soldier who's come forward because of you. You've been leading all along. Now you just need the bars to match it." Her throat tightened. She didn't trust her voice to respond. She just listened, the line humming, until he said quietly, "You're not defined by your scars, Rodriguez, but don't ever forget what they taught you." The call ended. She sat in the dorm, staring at the wall, the words echoing louder than the colonel's laugh ever had. The final weeks of OCS tested her in ways even combat hadn't. Sleep deprivation, endless drills, leadership under constant scrutiny. And yet Maya endured, not flawlessly, not without mistakes, but with resilience, with quiet strength, with the kind of calm that comes not from perfection but from survival. When graduation day came, she stood in line with the others, her uniform immaculate, her posture unshaken. The silver bars gleamed against her chest as they pinned them on. Second Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez. She had never wanted the title. She had never asked for it. But now, wearing it, she understood. It wasn't about rank. It wasn't about authority. It was about carrying her scars not as chains, but as proof that survival itself was a form of leadership. As the ceremony ended, she touched her chest lightly, feeling the scars beneath. The fragments shifted, a dull ache pulsing. But for once, the ache didn't feel like a reminder of what she had lost. It felt like a reminder of what she had become. Later that night, as she packed her duffel for the next assignment, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Not just a soldier, not just a survivor. A leader. And yet the question lingered, quiet but insistent. Would the world ever see her as more than the woman with scars? The answer lay ahead, in rooms she had yet to enter, in voices she had yet to hear, in battles that would not be fought with rifles but with truths too heavy to ignore. She exhaled slowly, shoulders squared, duffel zipped. The journey wasn't over, it was only changing shape. And as she stepped into the night, the stars above faint against the dark sky, she carried her scars not as burdens, but as a compass. Why did walking into the Pentagon feel more terrifying than walking into a battlefield? The convoy that had once carried her through Afghan dust now felt like a memory from another life. Here, polished marble floors stretched under fluorescent light. Security checkpoints hummed. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with power. Second Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez adjusted her uniform as she passed through the towering corridors. Each step echoed louder than she wanted, as though her boots betrayed her nerves. Around her, generals and civilians moved with quiet authority, their conversations clipped, their badges heavy with meaning. She had faced fire, shrapnel, the silence of dismissal. But this building of decisions and policies made her feel smaller than she ever had before. Because here, scars weren't enough. Here, she would have to convince the most powerful voices in the military that invisible wounds deserved to be seen. The first meeting was a briefing, a conference room filled with senior leaders from across the armed forces. The table was long, gleaming, papers neatly stacked. Generals, admirals, civilians from the Department of Defense all turned as she entered. Her throat tightened. She could feel their eyes, some curious, some skeptical, some already impatient. Colonel Mitchell sat at the far end, his posture steady, his expression calm. When their eyes met, he gave her the smallest nod. It was enough. She began. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. My name is Second Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez. I'm here to present the Invisible Wounds Initiative, a program designed to change how we understand and support service-connected medical conditions. Her voice was clear, but her palms were damp. She spoke of Helmand not with drama but with truth, of shrapnel left inside her body, of dizziness and headaches, of silence that had almost broken her. She spoke of soldiers too afraid to seek care, of officers who dismissed invisible pain, of the culture of fear that turned survival into shame. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply let the truth hang in the air. When she finished, the room was silent, not dismissive silence, not hostile silence, the kind that meant they were listening. Finally, General Hayes leaned forward. Her tone was calm but serious. Lieutenant, what do you believe this initiative has accomplished so far? Maya met her gaze. At Fort Campbell, medical appointments increased by 20% in the first 3 months. Soldiers who had avoided treatment began coming forward. Commanders adjusted their leadership to prioritize medical care as readiness, not weakness. And soldiers reported higher trust in leadership when invisible wounds were acknowledged. Another general, older, skeptical, asked, "But what about readiness? If everyone comes forward, won't that weaken our forces?" Maya's answer came without hesitation. "On the contrary, sir, ignoring invisible wounds weakens us. Soldiers who hide their conditions eventually break in combat, in training, or alone in their barracks. Readiness isn't silence. Readiness is resilience, and resilience requires care. The words landed, the silence deepened. Colonel Mitchell wrote something in his notebook, his lips pressed together in quiet pride. After the meeting, as the room emptied, Maya stood alone near the podium, her hands still trembling from the effort. "You did well." She turned. General Hayes stood there, her expression unreadable but her tone softer now. "Thank you, ma'am," Maya said. Hayes studied her. "You know, Lieutenant, the danger in being the face of something is that people stop seeing you as a person. They see you as a symbol. That can be heavy." Maya's chest tightened. "I'm already afraid of that, ma'am." Hayes nodded once. "Good, stay afraid. It means you'll remember you're human, just don't let it stop you." The general walked away, her heels echoing against the marble. Maya stood frozen, the words carving deeper than she expected. That night in her temporary quarters, Maya sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the scars across her chest. They glistened faintly under the lamplight. She whispered to them, "Do you see what you've done? You've followed me here. You've made me a symbol." Her reflection in the mirror stared back, strong posture, tired eyes, a uniform pressed to perfection. Was she still Maya, or just the woman with scars? The next day she attended another session, smaller, more intimate. Senior medical officers, psychologists, chaplains. They asked detailed questions about shrapnel, about PTSD, about the cultural stigma soldiers faced. One officer leaned forward. "Lieutenant, do you believe every soldier with trauma should speak publicly like you?" Maya shook her head firmly. "No, speaking out is a choice, not a requirement. My story isn't a blueprint, it's an opening, an invitation. No one should be forced to rip open wounds for validation. The point is to make silence less deadly." The room nodded. For the first time, Maya felt her words weren't just heard, they were understood. But understanding didn't erase the weight. That evening, Colonel Mitchell found her sitting alone outside the Pentagon courtyard. The air was crisp, the city lights glowing beyond the walls. "You disappeared after the session," he said. She shrugged, needed air. He sat beside her, silent for a while. Finally he asked, "What's eating at you?" She hesitated, then admitted, "I don't know who I am anymore. A soldier, an officer, an advocate, a symbol. Feels like the scars are louder than I am." The colonel leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Symbols aren't chosen, Rodriguez, they're made. And you don't get to control that, but you do get to control how you carry it." She looked at him, her eyes sharp. "What if I break under it?" "Then you break," he said simply. "And then you stand back up. That's what makes you more than a symbol. That's what makes you human." The words lingered long after he left. Weeks turned into months. The Invisible Wounds initiative spread. Bases across the country requested training. Reports came in of soldiers seeking care without fear of punishment. Leaders changed their policies. Maya traveled constantly, speaking, presenting, listening. Each time she told the story of Hellman, the shrapnel, the silence. Each time the scars reopened just enough to ache. And each time someone stayed behind afterward. A soldier, a commander, a medic, someone who whispered, "I thought I was alone." That was why she kept going. Not for the applause, not for the recognition, but for the quiet confessions whispered when the lights dimmed and the crowd faded. Still, the fear never left. The fear of becoming only the story, only the scars. One evening, after a long day of briefings, she stood in front of a mirror in her Pentagon quarters. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the familiar ridges. "Who are you now?" she whispered. The reflection stared back. Not the 19-year-old private who once dreamed of proving herself. Not the 22-year-old specialist bleeding in the dust of Helmand. Not even the sergeant who unbuttoned her uniform in defiance of a laugh. Someone else, someone carrying all of them. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders squaring. Maybe she didn't need to choose. Maybe she was all of it, soldier, officer, advocate, symbol, human. And maybe the scars weren't louder than her voice. Maybe they were her voice. But still, in the quiet hours before sleep, one question gnawed at her. How long could she keep reopening the same wound before it swallowed her whole? The answer waited in the years ahead, in battles not of deserts and gunfire, but of policy and perception. For now she lay back, closing her eyes, the ache of shifting fragments pulsing beneath her ribs. Not punishment, not weakness. A compass, guiding her forward into a world that still didn't fully understand. What happens when the strongest voice begins to tremble? At first, the Pentagon days felt purposeful. Meetings, briefings, training expansions. The Invisible Wounds initiative was spreading, and everywhere Maya went, people listened. But over time, the applause turned heavy. Each time she stood behind a podium, each time she lifted her uniform to reveal the scars, the fragments inside her seemed to grind deeper. Not physically, though the pain never left, but emotionally. Because every time she told the story, she wasn't just revisiting Helmand. She was living there again, smelling the smoke, hearing the screams, watching three brothers zipped into bags while she lived. And night after night, when the city went quiet, the ghosts returned. One evening, after a long day of briefings, Maya sat alone in her quarters. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air system. She stared at the ceiling, her chest burning from the dull ache of shifting fragments. She pressed her hand to her sternum, whispering to herself, "You're not just the scars, you're not just the scars." But the words no longer felt like truth. They felt like denial. Her phone buzzed. A message from Private Kim, now Corporal Kim. "Ma'am, I just wanted to thank you again. I'm still going to counseling, still standing. Wouldn't have made it without you." Maya smiled faintly, but the smile cracked quickly. Because the truth pressed harder, she wasn't sure she was still standing herself. The next morning she gave another presentation. A large auditorium full of senior leaders and young officers. The lights were bright, the microphone sharp. She began as always, calm and steady. She told them about Helmand, about shrapnel, about silence. But halfway through, her chest tightened. The migraine flared suddenly, vision blurring at the edges. She gripped the podium tighter, willing her voice not to break. 52 fragments, she said, her breath unsteady. Some removed, some still inside me. The words wavered, the crowd noticed. For the first time since she began the initiative, Maya felt her body betray her on stage. The colonel was there. His eyes caught hers, steady, commanding her to breathe. She forced herself to finish, her voice quieter now, trembling on the edges. When the session ended, she didn't stay to answer questions. She walked quickly out of the auditorium, the walls closing in, her chest screaming. Outside, she leaned against a cold marble column, pressing her forehead to the stone. Her breathing was ragged, her hands shaking. And for the first time in years, she whispered aloud the thought she had never dared speak. "I can't do this anymore." But the world didn't stop. Another briefing, another training, another soldier waiting to whisper me too. Maya kept going, step after step, word after word, until the day she collapsed. It was during a smaller workshop, only 20 officers in the room. She was explaining the stigma of PTSD when suddenly her vision went black. The floor rushed up, voices shouted, hands caught her before her head struck the ground. When she woke, she was in the medical wing. Dr. Martinez's face hovered above her, calm but serious. "Maya," she said softly, "you've been pushing too hard. The fragments are shifting again. You need rest." Rest? The word felt like betrayal. How could she rest when soldiers were still silent, when commanders were still skeptical, when lives depended on the change she was carrying? "I can't stop," Maya whispered hoarsely. "You can," Dr. Martinez replied. Because if you don't, the scars won't just remind you of survival, they'll kill you. The words hit harder than shrapnel. Colonel Mitchell visited later that evening. He didn't enter with authority. He entered with quiet eyes, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You scared them today," he said, handing her one. "Scared me too." Maya held the cup, her hands trembling against the warmth. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, sir." The colonel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're not meant to carry it alone. That's where you've gone wrong." She shook her head. "But they look at me, all of them. They see the scars, the story. If I stop, it all stops." "No," he said firmly. "If you stop, someone else will start. That's the point, Rodriguez. Leadership isn't about being the only one. It's about showing others they can lead too." Her throat tightened. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I don't want to be a symbol," she whispered. The colonel's voice softened. "Then stop trying to be, just be human. Humans stumble, humans rest, humans ask for help, and that's what makes them worth following." The words lodged deep, heavier than any lecture he had ever given. In the weeks that followed, Maya stepped back. Not entirely, but enough. She spoke less often. She allowed others, officers, medics, chaplains, to take the podium. At first it felt like failure, watching others tell her story, watching them carry her initiative. But slowly she saw the truth. It wasn't her story anymore. It belonged to all of them. And for the first time, Maya realized the weight was lighter when shared. One evening, as the sun set behind the Pentagon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Maya walked along the courtyard alone. Her hand rested on her chest, the scars aching faintly. But the ache no longer felt like chains. It felt like reminder. She whispered softly, "You're not just scars, you're not just scars." And for the first time in months, the words felt true again. But still one question lingered, louder than the rest. When the day came that she could no longer speak, would the silence undo everything she had fought for? The answer would come soon enough. Because history has a way of testing even the strongest voices. Why did the last presentation feel heavier than all the ones before? Maya stood in the Pentagon briefing hall, her uniform immaculate, her bars gleaming faintly under the lights. Rows of seats stretched before her, filled with generals, admirals, civilians, leaders whose pens could shape policy, whose decisions could ripple across every base in the country. The air was still. Anticipation pressed against her chest as sharply as the fragments that lived beneath her skin. She took a slow breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "when I first stood before a commander about my medical needs, he laughed. He thought I was making excuses. He thought silence meant nothing was wrong. But silence was killing me. And silence is killing soldiers every day." The room was motionless. No whispers, no shifting chairs, just listening. Maya continued, her words flowing now, not memorized but lived. "I carry 52 pieces of shrapnel in my body. Some were removed. Some remain. They move. They hurt. They remind me every day of the blast that should have ended me. But the fragments aren't the hardest part. The hardest part was being disbelieved. The hardest part was silence." She paused, her throat tight, her eyes scanning the room. Since Fort Campbell began the Invisible Wounds Initiative, soldiers have come forward. They've spoken of nightmares, panic attacks, hearing loss, migraines. They've spoken of the scars no one sees. And because they spoke, they lived. Because they spoke, they found care. Because they spoke, they carried on. Her voice softened, but her words sharpened. "We train soldiers to fight battles overseas. But we must also train ourselves to fight the battle here, the battle against silence, against stigma, against dismissal. Because readiness isn't the absence of wounds. Readiness is the willingness to heal." The silence that followed was different now. Not skeptical, not dismissive, heavy with truth. When the session ended, leaders surrounded her. Questions, handshakes, promises of expansion. But Maya felt none of the triumph. She felt only the dull ache beneath her uniform, the fragments shifting slightly, reminding her of the price behind every word. Later, as the hall emptied, she lingered, alone again, standing at the podium. Her hands rested on the cool wood, her reflection faint in the polished surface. For years she had feared being defined by her scars, but tonight she realized something new. The scars didn't define her, they testified for her. And sometimes, testimony mattered more than definition. That evening she walked out into the courtyard. The sun was dipping low, washing the marble walls in gold. The city buzzed faintly beyond the Pentagon gates, but inside all was calm. Colonel Mitchell stood waiting by the fountain, hands clasped behind his back. His silver hair glowed faintly in the fading light. "You did well," he said. Maya smiled faintly. "You always say that." "Because it's always true," he replied. They stood in silence for a while, watching the water ripple under the sunset. Finally Maya said softly, "Do you ever regret it, the way you doubted me at first?" The colonel's eyes stayed fixed on the water. "Every day, but I also know that without that mistake I might never have learned. Sometimes shame teaches harder than pride ever could." Maya nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of pain and gratitude. "Do you think it will last?" she asked. "The change?" He turned to her, his eyes steady. "It already has, because it's not about you anymore. It's about everyone who's spoken because you did first." She exhaled slowly, the weight inside her chest easing just a little. Years later, in a Pentagon conference room filled with leaders from every branch of the armed forces, Maya stood again. No longer a lieutenant, no longer unsure. She was confident, her voice clear. "The Invisible Wounds Initiative has reached bases across the country," she said. "Medical appointments are up. Stigma is down. Soldiers are alive today because silence was broken." As she spoke, she touched her chest briefly, where beneath her uniform the scars remained. The fragments still shifted, still burned, still reminded her. But they weren't chains anymore. They were compass points, guiding her, guiding others. That night, alone in her quarters, Maya sat by the window watching the city lights shimmer. Her reflection looked back at her, older now, steadier. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the familiar ridges beneath her skin. She whispered softly, "You're not excuses, you're not weakness, you're reminders, you're proof." The ache pulsed faintly, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like purpose. Because sometimes strength isn't the absence of scars. Sometimes strength is living with them, speaking through them, and choosing again and again not to let silence win. Maya Rodriguez closed her eyes, the hum of the city beyond the glass fading into stillness. The scars remained, the fragments shifted, the pain lingered. But so did the truth. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.